I think we'll go ahead and get started. So Chris, if you want to take us to the next slide. So my name is Kelsey Schmitz. I'm the school mental health lead for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'm joining you today from Olympia, Washington. I'm very excited to be able to moderate today's session. I want to thank you all for joining us for session 5 of our 8-part learning series, Mental Health, MHTTC, School Mental Health, Always and Now. On the next slide, just a few housekeeping items. Again, we've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure, and if we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will use your registration information to follow up. So to ensure the quality for the duration of this meeting, we've muted mics for all participants except for the speakers. If you have audio or technical issues during the session, the chat box is open for you to communicate with our team so that they can assist you. We want you to take a moment to locate the Q&A pod that should be near the bottom of your screen. And we have team members that are monitoring the Q&A pod and will ensure that the facilitators receive your questions. To open that Q&A pod, you just hover your cursor over the Zoom toolbar at the bottom and click on the Q&A function. We've scheduled ample time today for Q&A with our guests. That'll happen towards the end of the meeting, but we want you to feel free to enter your question at any time. So the session recording and the slide deck will be posted on our website within a few days. And again, a reminder that captions are available for today's session. And if you want to enable or disable those, you can click the CC button on the bottom of your Zoom platforms. If you're not already following us on social media, we encourage you to do that. All right. So again, welcome. We're glad you are all here with us today. It looks like we have a little over 300 people joining us. If you're new to us, this 8-part series is a collaborative effort of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Centers, known as the MHTTCs. We're a network that's funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And the MHTTC network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, who happen to be our co-hosts, along with the Northwest MHTTC today, and a network coordinating office. Our collaborative network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for the mental health field. After today's session, we would encourage you to visit our website. And if you haven't already found your regional center, we would encourage you to connect with them and stay in touch for more resources and training opportunities. So on the next slide, just a real quick disclaimer that this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions that are expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Then on the next slide, if you've been with us before, this will not be news to you. We will provide an evaluation link towards the end of our session. And as part of our SAMHSA funding, we're required to submit data related to the quality of this event. And just would encourage you to please take just a few moments and complete this brief survey. It should automatically pop up on your browser window after closing today's webinar. So here is a reminder that we have an opportunity for you after today's session to join regional breakout sessions so that you can ask questions about the content that we covered today, discuss with others in your region, in more of an informal moderated discussion with each of our school mental health leads that's contextualized to your specific region. The breakout sessions happen right after the webinar. And to participate in the 30-minute breakout sessions for your region, we will provide you the links that you need to get to those breakout sessions. All right, so again, if you are just now joining us, you are here for session 5, which is Mental Health Promotion for All, Tier 1. I'm Kelsey Schmitz, and I'm the School Mental Health Lead for the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'm excited to be with you today. So as many of you know, this 8-part training series uses the National School Mental Health Curriculum, Guidance and Best Practices for States, Districts, and Schools. This curriculum was developed by our network partnership with the National Center for School Mental Health in 2019, and it's intended to help states, districts, and schools advance comprehensive school mental health and engage in a planning process for implementation. And it includes a trainer manual, a participant manual, 8 sets of slide decks for each module, representing the core features of comprehensive school mental health and additional resources. Before I continue, I want to let everyone know that based on the feedback we have gotten from our participants, we have made a title change to this resource. Our network, in partnership with the National School for Mental Health, recently decided to remove the word curriculum from the title of this resource. This resource will now be referred to as National School Mental Health Best Practices, Implementation Guidance Models for States, Districts, and Schools. We've made the necessary updates to the resource materials and our website. And today's live session will consist of a discussion with a small panel of education and mental health leaders who will provide an always and now application of the School Mental Health Practices Implementation Guidance modules. While the modules are a great resource to utilize in normal school settings, it is also especially relevant in the current context with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the provision of school mental health services. So our panelists will share with us their experience using the implementation guidance modules and innovative ways for implementation in our current context. So you should see a poll that has popped up, and it looks like you all are doing an excellent job in answering the 2 questions. So I'll give just a couple more seconds if anybody else would like to participate in the poll. And I think we've got about 65% completed, Jessica. So when you're ready, I think we can share those results with everyone. So it looks like we're split today. About half have watched the video and half haven't. And then in terms of the level of mastery or competence with school mental health promotion, pretty even split. It looks like we've got folks just kind of right in the middle. So thank you for participating in our poll. Just a range of experiences that we have joining us today. And really great information for our panelists who will be introduced a bit later in the presentation. So for those who did not have a chance to watch the pre-session video, or you're like me these days and could really use a refresher, you are in luck. We have our guest, Chris, with us today to provide a recap of the module and serve as one of our panelists for the second part of our session. And so at this point, I'd like to ask Chris Gardamelia to come on video, and want to welcome Chris. She is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine National Center for School Mental Health. We're really excited to have her with us today. And at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Chris.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey, so much for the introduction and just the invitation to be here today. I'm going to start here. Just as a heads up, if you have watched the module, you know this is a jam-packed module. There is a ton of information in this one. So today we're going to go pretty rapidly. And the intention is this to be just a refresher, reminder of the highlights. If you didn't have an opportunity to watch the module, then maybe this will pique your interest in doing so. But because today is Tier 1 universal, a lot of what we talk about touches almost every aspect of school mental health we can think of. So what you see here on the slide is this is just the overview of all of the offerings across the modules. And we wanted to put this in here in particular today, just to give a reminder that there are things that are going to come up today that you're going to have questions about. I can think about things like funding or maybe teaming. And we may say, you know, it's a great question. I would really direct you to module 2 that has a lot of information about that. And that's not to try to not respond to questions, but because there are areas that, yeah, we've got tons more resources there. And just to be aware of how each of these modules can be used standalone, but then they also all coordinate with each other. So you'll see the flow of the program where we start off with, you know, what are the foundations? What is this? Why do we even want to be thinking about school mental health, to teaming, to how do I know what I need and what resources do I have to accomplish that, to screening, to Tier 1 universal supports, which is where we are today. And then in upcoming sessions, there'll be conversations around early intervention, treatment, what we think about as Tiers 2 and 3, funding and sustainability. And then last but not in any way least, the impact and how do we report out and gather data on what our outcomes are. So again, today we're focused on mental health promotion for all, Tier 1. We, of course, have our disclaimers here that these opinions are the views of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network and the National Center for School Mental Health, and we do not reflect any official positions of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. All material is in the public domain, and you'll see our recommended citation there at the bottom of this slide. Every module starts off with an agenda, and it's very much this similar format in what are we talking about? How are we defining that? Why are we talking about it? What is the value? How do I know that I'm doing it well? And what sort of things do I need to start thinking about to start planning for my state, my district, or my school? So where this module starts is little bits around what is mental health promotion, and then you'll see a little bit on value of mental health promotion. If this is something that you really need more information about, or you really need to be able to sell this to some of your stakeholders, that's where you want to go back to module 1. Tons of information in there about how school mental health can improve outcomes across the board, right? Not just mental health and well-being, which is of course important, but academic outcomes as well as things like graduation rates and attendance rates. Within here, this particular module, right, we start off with some of the most common Tier 1 services and supports. This is not an exhaustive list, but certainly the ones we hear talked about most frequently: school climate, teacher and school staff well-being. I will point out that this sits in module 5. Positive behaviors and relationships, positive discipline practices, mental health literacy, and social emotional learning. And then from there, we're going to talk about, you know, how would I choose a program? What are the things I should be considering? How do I know if something is evidence informed? What about the cultural and linguistic needs of my community? And then some information around implementation, ongoing supports, and how to, again, how do I know that I'm doing this well? So here's the list I just gave you. We start off with school climate. We have organized the school climate section around these areas. If this looks familiar to you, it is because this is the way that the Federal School Climate Survey is organized, the EDS-CLS. There are then some best practices in assessing school climate, and a couple tools that are highlighted for you. If you don't already have something in existence, here are some things to look for. Embedded throughout this module are a couple different district examples that give you information on how a district actually did put this in place, what they found, and what seemed to be particularly interesting for that district. How do you know that you are doing this correctly? Again, there's a couple reflection questions embedded throughout. So if you're working with a team, this would be a point to kind of sit with your team and go, okay, so what do we know at this point? We've assessed school climate. Now we'd like to improve our school climate. So we now drop into some best practices around interventions for school climate. You'll see here, there's a series of supports and guides that we point you toward. And at the end of both this module and all modules, there's I think for this module, there's like 4 or 5 slides that are just lists of resources with links to them. So any resource that you see here that you're interested in, there are links directly from the modules to get to those resources. So other climate improvement resources and interventions. This is where then staff well-being comes online. I do want to point out that as we talk about staff well-being in this module, there's certainly some information on self-care and why that's important, but we have also given at least equal attention to organizational implementation and needs for the organization to be attending to well-being, as well as some strategies for individuals, right? So how do we know if we need to work around well-being and how our teachers and staff are doing? Here are some things we would think about and best practices for assessing. Here are guidance on some tools that are there that you might look to. And again, we've assessed, now we know we want to do something. What might that look like? So best practices around improving teacher and staff well-being and some programs to help you get started or give you some ideas. Now we talk about school-wide expectations about positive behaviors, right? Setting those expectations. We of course cannot talk about positive behaviors without talking about PBIS. Certainly one of the most looked to resources here. So we start here with some information, some links to get more information. If your district is not currently using PBIS, you want to learn a little more. Then some best practices around implementing positive reinforcement systems, PBIS or not, whatever strategies you're using, these are the best practices that you're going to want to keep in mind. And then some additional tools around how do I implement. One of the questions that we frequently get across the nation is, so we've been doing PBIS for a while, we're coming online with more school mental health stuff. We're super confused about how all of this plays together. And it's feeling a little bit like we have to do all this new stuff or I don't really understand how all this connects. So you'll see here and on the next slide, there's some guidance around interconnected systems framework, which helps understand how all of these things play together because they do, and they all intersect in fact quite nicely. This is a web series that digs a little more into the why, what, and how of integrated systems frameworks. All right, so then we move on to building healthy relationships, sense of community, right? We are coming to understand more and more how much our relationships really impact our climate, eventually academic outcomes, our well-being. It's really pervasive in our systems. When we talk about relationships, we of course often talk about restorative practices, certainly a practice that is steeped in the relationship and relationship building. So if you want to learn a little more, there's a couple resources here about what are restorative practices, what all does it involve? And then in general, promoting or using discipline practices that reduces exclusionary discipline responses, right? So anytime out of class suspension, out of school suspensions, expulsions, referrals on to other systems that would then take the kid out of the classroom. So I want to reduce my suspensions. Where can I look to for some resources? This is going to be extremely helpful to you. Here's some additional briefs and training information around restorative practices and how this intersects specifically with school discipline and school mental health. As we talk about mental health and what can we do to promote and all these various strategies, right? Some of the foundational things to think about are how we call it mental health literacy, right? So how much do our adults and our kids understand about mental health? This is oftentimes where you might want to start just thinking about, what do we all know about it? What are the thoughts out there? This is often a good place to start addressing stigma, right? So if I want to increase the mental health literacy for my students and staff, here are some best practices. And again, we're going to see some helpful tips and some programming that might be helpful to you if you were kind of dipping your toe into these waters and figuring out what direction you would like to go. This brings us to social emotional learning, something that we are hearing a lot about this past year, much to my delight. I'm really glad to see this taking a very forward position in school mental health. But let's start into, right, what are the practices that support social emotional learning skill development for all students? Again, you'll see some best practices here to keep in mind. Much like PBIS and positive behavior, can't really talk about SEL without talking about CASEL and the CASEL wheel. Certainly somebody who has been a leader in this area. And I do want to also note that CASEL has a lot of information now extending this wheel and talking about how we would embed cultural responsiveness and appropriateness into these materials. Here are some program guides to help give you a place to start and a district example of a district who started to implement some SEL, what their experiences were, and what positive outcomes they experienced. So that first part is all about kind of digging a little more into what are the types of services and supports we might think about under Tier 1. The remainder of the module is about, okay, how do we actually make this work? So we start with implementation and fidelity indicators. I do want to let you know that some of this material is then duplicated in the next module, Tier 2, Tier 3, so that you have that information there. If all you want to be looking at is Module 5, it's here. If you're really focused on Tiers 2, 3, this information will also be embedded in that module. So how do I know things are evidence informed, and why do I want things that are evidence informed? Multiple resources and best practices here around thinking through evidence informed and what I might be looking at and what else I might need to consider. It's one thing to ask, is there a research base and what outcomes look like? But an extension of that is to ask, who was this research base developed with? Who was served? What does that population look like? Does that reflect my community? And do I feel like this particular intervention is going to fit the needs of my community? Okay, some information here on sources of evidence, places that you might go to start digging through the overwhelming at times amount of information out there about evidence-based practices and recommended programs. This again speaking to, okay, there's some evidence base, but what are the unique strengths, needs, and cultural linguistics consideration of my community, right? Of my students, of my family, how to start thinking through, gather information, and get feedback on that aspect of programming. And then some worksheets and resources on selecting evidence-based programs. You'll see this slide, and in fact, the next are around selecting, implementing, and preparing. Great, we have decided we're going to do this programming. We have done our research on what we want to do, but we need adequate resource capacity to implement, right? Lovely, best plans, but if I don't have the resources to actually make this happen, then I'm not going to get the outcomes that I was hoping to get. So this is the next space that we explore. There's some intervention planning forums here. And other guides around, this is from Healthy Safe Children. How do I implement this in a school setting? Some checklists to be thinking about ahead of time, and some best practices around supporting training and professional development. I think we're all pretty clear at this point that the one-off hope and train just isn't as effective as we would like our interventions to be. Again, if you're having to push and sell this to somebody, you know, well, why should we pay for consultation to continue to come back after the initial training? There's going to be some great resources for you here. What does research say about training? Why we do need ongoing supports, and how do I know that I'm implementing in the way that the intervention was intended and with fidelity with my population? So you'll see some best practices here. What is fidelity monitoring? A checklist for fidelity monitoring, and some helpful tips. One thing we really like to just make sure people take away is, you know, fidelity monitoring is all about, or at least in part, about helping you figure out if you're not getting the outcomes that should have come from the programs you're selecting, figuring out where is it going wrong. And there can be a lot of nuances in how things are implemented, and a lot of reasons why things are hitting or not hitting. But we don't want to abandon a program if in fact there were a couple tweaks to implementation or to our support that we could have done that in fact would have improved outcomes for us. Again, you'll see a district example here and some reflection questions to guide your thinking with your team around these issues. And then This final slide, which is very similar in each of the modules. You've got all this great information. What is this actually going to look like for us? Where do we start with our strategic planning, starting to outline some goals and potential action steps? So that is the very brief, I hope around 10-minute overview of this module. Again, the goal is not to really give you a lot of information here, but at least to give you the roadmap to this is what you can find in the module, and this is where you might want to go look. It's just a last reminder, you know, there are the 7 other modules that are going to cover things like, how do I fund this? Who should I be working with in my community? How do I know what I need? Like, I know I have a broad need. I'm really not sure about my specific need. That's all module 3 about needs assessment, resource mapping. And then of course, additional information about tiers 2 and 3, and how to track your progress and report back out. Multiple slides here with resources, citations, really great stuff to look through. And that is my part. And thank you very much. We are going to turn now to our panelists.
Wow, I feel like if we were all in a room, we would just like have some loud applause for the way that you marched through all of that material. As you mentioned, there is a lot to be covered in this module, and what a wonderful job you did of recapping that. So thank you, so much for doing that. So now we're going to move on to our next portion of our session, and I'm really excited to invite our panelists to come on and just share a bit about them and be able to turn it over to them to share some information. So today we have with us Susan Barrett, who's the director of the Center for Social Behavioral Supports at Old Dominion University. She is also an implementer partner with the U.S. National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. She also co-leads the development of the interconnected systems framework that Chris referred to in her recap. So I'm excited to have Susan with us today. We also have Sarah Howell with us. Sarah is a school social worker at Las Americas Newcomer School in Houston and manages the social work department at Houston Revision, and is the founder of STAR, which is Survivors of Torture, Asylees and Refugees Counseling and Consultation, and also pursuing her doctorate in clinical social work at the University of Pennsylvania. And then finally, we have Dr. Jennifer Cabista. And Dr. Cabista is joining us from Central School District in Oregon, where she is the superintendent there. So I'm just super pleased to have all these amazing folks that have joined us today for our panel. And to get this kicked off, we have some questions for our panelists. And our first question is to have them tell us a little bit more about who they are, their role, and how Tier 1 mental health promotion plays out in their work. And we're going to go in this order. We're going to start with Susan, and then go to Sarah, and then Jennifer.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey. And thanks to everyone who's participating today. It's really an honor to be with you. Again, my name is Susan Barrett, and I work at the Center on PBIS. I have worked there for about 20 years. And the first thing you need to know, if you're not familiar with PBIS, is that it is a very iterative process. We have learned a lot over the last 20 years. It is the most scaled up of all the human services. And we're really proud to be connected with the School Mental Health. We have an iterative process that you've been learning about called the Interconnected Systems Framework. And we worked with Dr. Nancy Lever and Dr. Sharon Stephen and Dr. Mark Wiest on the development of the Interconnected System Framework, which is really the deliberate application and integration of pulling in the community mental health system into the education arena and really scripting the moves in a step-by-step format for being able to do a complete systems change and kind of systems reform, if you will. So just to tell you a little bit more about myself, I've been in education for many, many years. I started out as a volunteer, a substitute teacher, a classroom teacher, a school counselor, a crisis response team member, and finally an administrator. So I've played so many different roles within the school system that really has informed, I think, my ability to kind of pull in kind of the common threads. So I see tier one as being such an important part of this, because in all of our work, I think we get caught in this label and diagnose and focus on one student at a time. And I think one of the ways that the public health framework helps us in making sure that we're working much more effectively and efficiently is that the first thing we need to look at is to make sure that the majority of our students, their families, and our staff are thriving in the ecosystem, in the environment, before we start to think about ways that we create advanced tier support. So I think framing and using the public health framework is a really great tool that allows us not only to kind of reframe how we think of mental health, in that there's such a continuum there, and we all have a role to play in that. So whether that's greeting students at the door or getting access to services and supports within an office space, those all kind of expand our notion of what mental health is. So it's really this shifting away from labeling and diagnosing. So sorry, my dog is barking in the background. She's just saying hello to everyone. It's really that shifting from thinking about one student at a time to making sure that student is getting adequately supported, but then when they go back in the classroom and when they go back in the school, they're in an ecosystem that's positive, that's nurturing, that's caring, and that's supporting their individual elements into the natural context. The other thing about the public health system framework that I love is that it helps us organize the effort. We are drinking from a fire hose right now. There is so much to kind of comb through, so much to kind of understand. We're seeing a lot of splintering effects as a result of the attention that we have in the mental health space. We're hearing a lot about trauma informed. We're hearing a lot about screening. We're hearing a lot of these things kind of getting thrown at us. And so what I think really helps us is that public health framework helps us organize and say, what is it that we're going to do for all? What is it that we're going to do for some? And what is it that we're going to do for few? The other thing I think it really helps us do is bring in the community partners into the space of school. Schools are not going to be able to do this alone, and we need our critical friends in the community to come in and engage in a common way of work and really shift our thinking from having our community providers just be situated at those upper tiers, but really situating them and helping us define and build a pro-social community. So I think that there's a lot on the horizon to be excited about. I think the potential is there for us to create a healthier way forward. It's time to disrupt the status quo. It was never working before COVID. We had a crisis on our hands before COVID. And I think this year has really let us know that if we're really going to be effective, we have to give equal priority for social, emotional, behavioral, mental health right alongside academic achievement. And we have this potential, right, to reverse trends and create a healthier way forward. And by leaning into this notion of the public health framework, this tiered logic, this tier one promotion and prevention, we actually can help mitigate the need for advanced tiers if we're really focused on people's environments that are more nurturing. And so we're really relying again on this prevention science and the work of Tony Biglin and others that are helping us achieve that way forward. So I'm going to pause there and let the other panelists kind of talk about their role in and their stories in figuring out how to kind of create a healing movement and really pulling in that tier one promotion and prevention effort in their work. So I'll turn it over. I think Jennifer is going next, Kelsey.
Sarah.
So thank you. My name's Sarah Howell. I I am on my campus right now, and kids keep popping in because a closed door doesn't really mean much. So excuse me as I wave kids out. During the school day, during a typical 8 to 5, I am the school social worker at Las Americas Newcomer School. We're a special newcomer campus in Houston Independent School District in Houston, Texas. So we only have the newest of the new kiddos. And I describe our student population as forced migrants. So traditionally it was more resettled refugees, and with the wave of unaccompanied kids, we are about 90%, 93% Central American right now. Um, so Tier 1 looks really different on our campus. My background was immigrant mental health before coming in here, and schools as a second, kind of, and it's always trauma and the immigrant community, but trying to figure out how to fit that in a school has been a little bit an interesting process. So on my campus, I am a campus-based social worker. There's very few of us in the district. Most go through other agencies. But in my campus, I fulfill both kind of an administrator role and the social worker role. So I get to have a foot in both worlds, which means I get to really influence programming. We have, over the past couple of years, we've brought in restorative practices, working with newcomers, but trying to tweak what that looks like with the newcomer population with virtually no English. And let me preface this with, when I say forced migrants, we specialize in kids that have never been to school before or had very interrupted education. So we don't get to just talk about circles, we have to act it out, and we use a lot of visuals. So everything we do, we have to look through an enhanced lens. So we do restorative practices. I brought in a couple other interventions that I've designed, like horticulture therapy with our garden, some animal assisted work that all kids have access to, and then we can do some higher levels of intervention, but something that everybody does on the Tier 1 side. And then my baby over the last couple of years has been creating my own social emotional curriculum that really hits the needs of what our kids experience. And so it's kind of evolved over the years, but it plays out in a class. Now, with COVID and pandemic, things have been a little wonky, but pre-COVID and in the beginning of this year, it looked like a 30 to 40 minute class that every student gets every single day that's just social emotional learning. And I mean, trauma informed, all sorts of just hitting on all of the concepts, but considering we have grades 4 through 8 and we're giving kiddos every single social skill that you would need plus mental health, trying to adapt to life in the United States through a social emotional lens. So it's fun, but it's a very different experience, and we place a very high priority on social emotional work and how to reach everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for the very important work that you're doing and the commitment that you have to your students. I'm just so thrilled that you could join us and that we could elevate the work that's happening at your school and the work that you're leading. So thank you for being here. Jennifer?
Good morning, all. My name is Dr. Jennifer Cabista. I am the superintendent of Central School District. Just to give you geographically where we're located, I'm about 10 miles southwest of Salem, Oregon, which is our capital. We are considered rural school district. I'm about a population of 3,100 students, but I'm a school district that is rural, that is a majority students of color. That actually happened this past year. I have been here 4 years, and as I took over, I knew that would be moving in that direction, which was exciting for me as a superintendent. We have a large Latinx student population. We also have are in a migrant area within Oregon. Within that population, about 17% of our students are emerging bilinguals. And we take great pride in that, that we see that as an asset. Many people don't see that as an asset. We're trying to change that language, not only here in Oregon, but I think that's what we need to do across this country as well, as we continue to support our students and our communities and the cultures that we serve within our communities. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my philosophy. I am non-traditionally trained, so and I start with that because I think it's really important, because a lot of the questions I have asked over the years is really looking at what the public education system is and how we need to at times make changes in it. I believe that our job is to develop the whole child, which means that they're not only academically successful, but they're behaviorally, physically, socially, emotionally healthy, safe, engaged, supported, and challenged in their learnings each and every day. That philosophy also includes my staff. So we'll talk a lot about whole child, whole educator, whole community. So our whole educator is a big part of our learning and our mantra here in our school district, where our educators are learning, growing, living. And when we mean living, that they're both happy and healthy, and that's physically and mentally healthy, that we are working constantly to support our students and each other, and that we're leading because everyone within our school district is a leader in their positions that they hold. And so again, we have that at the forefront as we engage in our processes here in Oregon. I did come from, just to give an idea, I did come from the second largest school district in Washington, where I had the opportunity even to work with Kelsey, and I still get the opportunity to work with her these days as we developed what's called the Whole Child Initiative. Really, how do you embed that social emotional learning with academics? And then obviously, since I've been here in Oregon, now we're adding in the mental health a part of that within our framework. I'm going to go back to what Susan said to talk a little bit about Tier 1. I think it's imperative, especially those of you that are in public education, and I know we may have some charter schools and other independent schools in here, but as we talk about education holistically, it is really important that we are looking at both public health and public education and how we can at times collectively work together and not silo. I think that aha for me about 7 years ago when we were doing our implementation at with the whole child, and then what we've continued to do down here in Oregon, I think is really important for us as educators and leaders in these fields to continue to have those conversations. I am a big believer in Tier 1. I think, and actually people get tired of me, even as a superintendent and in my previous job, of saying, I always go back to Tier 1. Tier 1 always has to be the focus, because if you're not doing Tier 1, then there's a potential that majority or larger amounts of your students and staff may need Tier 2 and Tier 3 or have Tier 2 and Tier 3 needs, which is when that's where we have to implement and resources there. So I think it's really important as we talk about this that, you know, my staff at times gets tired of saying, oh, Jen, you've talked about this 100 times. I will continue to talk about it 100 times because that's how imperative it is. You must be successful at your Tier 1 approaches. It will allow you, because again, those are the areas where I like to say they're good programs that are not very expensive, that you can do on a daily basis, as easy as greeting students at the door, and relationship. Relationship doesn't cost anything. It costs time, and it's time well spent to be able to then work through what you may need to work with additional needs with students, your staff, and then the families within the community. A part of my other job that I have the opportunity to be a part of, I'm also a part of the Executive Council, and I know that was in my bio a little bit here, but we have coordinated care systems of care here in Oregon, and it's actually done by our counties. And so we get the opportunity, I sit in Polk County, and we partner with Marion County, that we're 2 counties next to each other, to really have an executive council that is a mix of mental health providers, as well as educators, as well as university supports, that we meet and really focus on how do we do this, you know, work smarter, not harder. How do you build those partnerships together to make sure that we're doing what's right and just for students and families within our communities? And I just want to talk about just a couple things that we focus on with our core values. I think it's really important that as we do this work, that it's not only your youth that we're at the forefront, but what our families need. Because again, a lot of times when we know we're looking at potential needs of students, it's not students, and it can also be involved with family. I think there has to have a community-based part of that. I talk a lot about that and build partnerships. That is one of the things that I think is crucial in this work that we do together. And again, even in the tier 1 area, you can have partners to help do that. It's really important from an equity lens, and one of our key pieces is that it is culturally and linguistically competent. We have made major shifts here since I've been here in our school district, and what we continue to do within the community to honor the cultures and the diversity within our community and supporting our students in that way and our families. And then how do you coordinate and collaborate? Because that's a huge part of that. That takes time. I want to be clear about that. That takes time, and it can be painful at times to get that going, but it is well worth the time of that resource, because you're not going to, with building that time with the collaborative, your resources, you're not funding all larger programs that can be very expensive because you've done the work on the ground. And then how do you make sure that you're really looking at the strengths base? I think that's that's really important as we do this work of focusing on strengths first. And working through that. And then last piece I will say is, just as you think about this and within our school district, part of the reason I am here is we are actually a trauma-informed school district. We actually have a trauma-informed policy that drives our work. And I know I'll put it in the chat here in a minute, but I think that's a huge part of how and why we do our work. I think that's an important piece that we are continuing to build on within our school district and really helping to support all of these approaches. And I'll talk a little bit more about frameworks and the actual tier 1 that we do within our school district, but really excited to be able to just share and learn. Again, part of this is also a learning opportunity to learn from Sarah and Susan as we go through this process. So thanks for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you, Dr. Cabista. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and the amazing work that you and your team are leading in Oregon. So I think now we're going to move to talking a little bit about challenges of Tier 1. And this question is going to be for Sarah and Jennifer. So can you talk a little bit about some challenges of Tier 1 and some recommendations? And we're running a little bit behind on time. So just some brief things around what your challenges have been and what recommendations you might have for others. Sarah, you want to go?
Sure. It's kind of speaks to what I've already mentioned, finding things that are appropriate for our kiddos. I have, like I said, grades 4 through 8. Our kids have had extremely adult experiences and virtually no socialization. And so trying to find things that don't seem babyish, that hit on the correct developmental stages, but also like hitting the needs. So, and then applicable to different cultures. So it's applicable to a brand new Guatemalan migrant who just crossed the border. It looks very different than what's necessary for a Mexican-American Latino young man who's born and raised here. Likewise, my Afghan girls and my Congolese kids just have different needs. And so figuring out, there are certain themes, so like bullying, everybody needs to be addressed, but everyone can have a benefit from some conversations about, but how to have those conversations and how to make it seem important, relevant, culturally sensitive has probably been the biggest challenge. So I'd say asking what people need, observing, and then using your professional knowledge to integrate. Everything that I do, I use through the lens of my social work, therapy knowledge, knowledge of trauma, knowledge of how people know the stages of change, and then of course like academics. So it's just pulling all together. But it hasn't ever worked for me to take something off the shelf, knowing what your community needs and tweaking.
So I'm going to go ahead, Kelsey.
You go ahead.
So I'm going to take us up a little bit, because as I saw people introducing themselves, I know we have a mix of, I'm going to call implementers and then also high-level policy leaders on this webinar today. So a couple things I'm going to talk about is, first, some of the challenges. You have to have buy-in. I think that is the first part of that. And my next statement is, and I say this, my staff, when we prepare for whether one of us is going to share, and they always remind me that I need to publicly say this every time that we have an opportunity. to share. And one of the things that they always say is, to me, is why we are being successful is that we have buy-in, and that buy-in is supported by not only the district leadership, but the building leadership, administration, all the way down within our system, so that we are all walking and talking this talk about the supports of how imperative it is to have tier 1 and mental health supports within the buildings and moving forward with that. So again, I think that can be big challenges that you may run into. Again, for many of you, if your superintendent doesn't talk that talk or your chancellor doesn't talk that talk, that can be barriers in that implementation phases. I think that is a very important piece that people do not talk enough about as we look at shifting our systems to not only supporting academically, but again, from that mental health, social, emotional, culture, climate within the schools. At times, funding at that high level can be a barrier. I think that is a huge part of that. I think in Oregon, I feel lucky. In 2019, our state legislature passed what's called the Student Success Act. And this is actually in collaboration between educators and the business world, where the business is taking a tax to support what we are trying to build, because our businesses in our state said, we need to make some shifts that students are not coming out that workforce or college ready. And so they are working with us and have embedded and financially are supporting that. Because of that, I have been able to embed mental health providers with a collaborative partnership with our county. So I have a mental health provider in every one of our schools. That's on top of counselors. So that's not just that, it's our mental health providers are in there. I was able to hire a whole child coordinator. That whole child coordinator has a mental health background. I think that was very important to me as we move forward into this, into Oregon and what we are trying to accomplish with those pieces. So again, I think funding can be at a high level. I think you have to be strategic in working with your school leaders, your district leaders, again, your charter leaders, depending on what area you are talking through, because those can be some beginning challenges that, again, once you get those out of the way. I do also think tier 1, as we've said, greeting students at the door, building relationships, that there's not a price tag on that. That's just price tag of time. And so I do think that how do you start with some basic things that everyone can buy into and that you're continuously doing? And I think that's a big part of it. I'm a superintendent that walks buildings, so kids know me. I think that relationship, that even being able to do that both with our staff, helps to build that tier 1 as we look at those pieces. So again, the other piece that I would say, and last thing, is just that as you do these approaches, academics, behavior, social, emotional, mental health, they are not separate. They need to be braided and blended together in the school day. They are not separative initiatives. We may train at times separately, but we work to how does this and what does this look like daily within, or what does that look like daily within our system? So I think that is one of the challenges of how do you help staff and students really build that into your school day moving forward.
Awesome. Again, I know we're running short on time, but such a rich discussion, such great work that you all are doing. I'm wondering, Sarah or Jennifer, maybe if one of you could speak to how we might ensure equitable and anti-racist practices in Tier 1 before we wrap up.
So here's what I'll share to start. So this has to be part of your, at least in my opinion, it needs to be part of your mission and vision within your district or within your organization. I'm going to say within our strategic plan, we have district 10 strategic objectives. And one of those is that our decision processes is with an equitable lens to ensure that our students have supportive learning environments. I also think our Oregon Department of Education, they are very clear and continue within our mission of the state that equity is at the forefront. So that is a big part of our conversation. Are we culturally with our students and with our staff and diversifying our staff, which is part of that process of how we do that. I think the other piece when you talk about this is as you have buy-in, my board is a big part of this. So we have equity presentations at every board meeting. It's a part of our process to make sure that we are moving in that direction where we're being able to show what's happening in our schools in that tier 1 with an equity lens tied to that. I think the other piece is you need to be talking about anti-racist practices and having your staff and including myself, the training and professional learning. Right now, we as a school district, our district equity team, which includes me, we are going through some anti-racism and universal design for learning, professional learning right now, so we can continue to embed those into our practices. It is also a piece where equity, and this comes from my whole child coordinator, we talk about this a lot, that equity is not, it cannot be separated from the work of mental health, that we braid and blend that together as part of that process. And again, tier 1 is the most important part, as my whole child coordinator and I say, it's the most important mental health work that needs to happen, and that it needs to be done in safe spaces, that we honor all voices and experiences as we do that work. And those are a huge part of some of the practices we're using to really make sure they're equitable and that they are anti-racist practices in tier 1.
Thank you, Jennifer. I know we're at the end of our time, and we have one question that I'm going to ask Susan to sum up. This is her challenge. Susan, 15 to 20 seconds. What are specific roles? Talk just a moment about specific roles for community behavioral health providers at tier 1 promotion.
Yeah, so really quickly, we absolutely need our community providers to, and the team's role at tier 1 is to actively uncover the needs of students before they come into our schools. And so what the community providers offer us is that data set that's out in the community that informs us about what the needs are so that we can fortify and strengthen what we offer at tier 1 so nobody has an opportunity to fail. Too often we kind of wait for folks to fail before we kick it up a notch. And so this is really a way to get in front of it and again, make sure that we're preventing the likelihood of anybody failing and that everybody's thriving. In terms of funding, we need to work at the district level. There's specific things that the state and district can do that remove barriers for implementation at the school. And so we've offered volume 2 of our interconnected systems framework, which really scripts the move at the district and at the school level to install some of these key implementation components and really gives you step-by-step guidance on how to make this happen in your system. And so the district really needs to remove that barrier of funding to allow our mental health providers to be situated across all tiers of support so that they can not only provide that data, but they can also consult with us on what to do to fortify and strengthen our tier 1 implementation effort.